On the night of August 10, 1977, just after 10 p.m., a quiet residential block in Yonkers, New York, settled into the kind of stillness that follows a long summer heat. The city had spent more than a year gripped by fear. Headlines shouted the same name, Son of Sam. Couples avoided parked cars. Parents kept teenagers home. The police presence across Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx had grown into one of the largest manhunts in NYPD history. And yet the killer remained anonymous, unpredictable, and eerily mobile. What finally broke the case was not a dramatic chase nor a confession, but a simple traffic ticket. Detectives had been reviewing hundreds of reports near the site of the last shooting on July 31, 1977, in Brooklyn, the attack that killed Stacy Moskowitz, the final victim. Amid dozens of witness statements, one detail stood out. A woman had seen a suspiciously parked yellow Ford Galaxy near the crime scene shortly before the attack. NYPD investigators pulled parking summons records from that night. One vehicle matched. The ticket had been issued only minutes before the shooting. The car was registered to David Berkowitz, 24 years old, living in Yonkers. For weeks, the name had meant nothing, but now detectives noticed something uncanny. Berkowitz lived only a few buildings away from the address mentioned in one of the bizarre letters the Son of Sam killer had sent to the police, a coincidence too striking to ignore. As the heat pressed down on the city, NYPD detectives drove quietly to 35 Pine Street, a brick apartment building perched above a steep hill. They arrived late at night, not wanting to alert neighbors. The block was dim, the streetlights hazy in the humidity. Officers spread out in silence. The yellow Ford Galaxy sat where the records said it would be. Through the car window, with the beam of a flashlight, they saw a bag filled with ammunition, another containing a handgun, and a letter addressed to a police captain. It was enough for probable cause. They stepped back, strategizing. No sirens, no spotlight. The department didn't want a confrontation with a killer who shot without hesitation. Just before midnight, the building's front door opened. A young man with a relaxed stride walked toward the car, carrying nothing, dressed in plain clothes, almost nondescript. When he reached for the door handle, detectives stepped forward quickly, weapons drawn, voices low but firm. "David," one detective said, "don't move." Berkowitz froze. For a moment, it seemed he might run. Instead, he turned slowly, expression calm, almost curious. His eyes were tired, unfocused, as if he had been expecting this moment or welcoming it. The detective opened the car door, removed the gun from the front seat, and looked directly at him. Then came the quiet words that would enter NYPD history. "Now that you've got me, what's your next move?" He smiled faintly, not triumphant, but hollow. Another detective leaned in. "You know why we're here?" Berkowitz nodded once. "Well," he said, "I guess you know. I'm Sam." He didn't struggle, didn't argue, didn't deny anything. The long manhunt, 13 shootings, 6 dead, 7 wounded, a city terrorized, ended not with force, but with that soft, unsettling surrender on a late summer night. Inside the squad car, he stared through the window as they drove away from Pine Street. He asked no questions. Officers noted the calmness that defined him, a quietness that felt more disturbing than any resistance. When they reached the station, Berkowitz began speaking without hesitation. He mentioned the .44 caliber revolver, the letters, the nights he drove through the boroughs searching for victims. He answered questions with a flat, almost mechanical tone. For the first time in more than a year, New York exhaled. The killer, who had slipped through dozens of stakeouts, evaded the largest police task force in the city's history, and turned whole neighborhoods into empty, fearful streets, was finally behind a locked door. And the investigation, now freed from guesswork and speculation, moved into its next phase, understanding how a quiet postal worker from Yonkers became the figure whose name had haunted an entire city. David Berkowitz was born June 1, 1953 in Brooklyn, to a single mother, Betty Broder, who gave him up for adoption within days. His biological father's identity was concealed from him. His mother, overwhelmed and financially unstable, believed adoption was the only path. The infant was placed into the care of Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, a middle-aged Jewish couple from the Bronx who longed for a child but had struggled to conceive. Nathan and Pearl were quiet, steady people, a hardware store clerk and a homemaker who offered David a stable home. They described him later as bright but troubled, energetic but easily frustrated. From early childhood, he displayed signs of emotional volatility. Teachers noted he was difficult to console when upset, prone to sudden bursts of anger, and unusually sensitive to corrections. Yet he was not violent. He was simply restless, unfocused, unsettled. By the age of 5, David had begun to show patterns of withdrawal. He preferred solitary play, often wandering through the neighborhood alone, exploring alleys, vacant lots, and rooftops. Neighbors remembered seeing him standing for long stretches, staring into the distance, as though studying something no one else could see. His adoptive parents attributed this to a vivid imagination, but the behavior persisted into adolescence. School provided little relief. Academically, he performed below average. Emotionally, he appeared disconnected from classmates. Teachers described him as distracted, drifting, slow to form bonds. He was bullied occasionally, not with physical violence, but with the subtle isolation that comes from being perceived as different. His reaction was to retreat further inward. A defining fracture occurred when he was 14. Pearl, the adoptive mother to whom he was deeply attached, died of cancer. The loss destabilized him. Nathan remarried quickly, hoping to restore domestic stability, but David felt displaced, resentful, and increasingly alienated from the home in which he had grown up. Friends later recalled that his behavior became erratic: long absences from home, declining grades, a growing fascination with fires, night wandering, and small acts of vandalism. Around this time, David began seeking answers about his origins. When he discovered that he was adopted, the revelation struck him with quiet violence. He confronted his adoptive father, demanding to know the truth. Nathan provided only partial answers. David then located his biological mother, meeting her briefly as a teenager. Instead of closure, the meeting left him feeling rejected anew. He later described it as confirmation that he had been unwanted from the beginning. By 18, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, hoping structure would stabilize him. Military life provided routine, but not relief. Fellow soldiers described him as socially isolated, yet generally cooperative. He completed his service without incident, but his time in the Army did not resolve the growing disquiet inside him. After discharge, he returned to New York, drifting through jobs before settling into work as a postal sorter, a position that offered predictability but little fulfillment. In 1974, shortly after returning, David legally changed his name to David Berkowitz, aligning himself fully with his adoptive parents. But the symbolic gesture did not ease his growing paranoia and loneliness. He lived alone in small apartments in the Bronx and Yonkers, often spending nights driving without purpose through the boroughs. Co-workers later recalled he was polite but distant, the kind of person who was present physically but felt absent emotionally. During these years, he began writing disjointed diaries filled with frustration, confusion, and a sense of profound isolation. He recorded feelings of invisibility, resentment toward the world, and an emerging belief that forces beyond him were shaping his fate. These writings were not coherent plans or threats, more the fragmented reflections of a mind slipping gradually away from ordinary perceptions of life. By the mid-1970s, David had become a familiar silhouette in Yonkers, solitary, introspective, rarely engaging beyond necessity. He kept to himself, avoided friendships, and moved through the city with a quiet anonymity that allowed him to pass unnoticed. When attacks began in 1996, investigators would later note that nothing in his outward life provided a clear warning. He was an unremarkable young man, a postal worker, a loner, a neighbor whose presence did not disturb. But beneath that ordinary exterior, a long, silent trajectory had been forming from childhood. Loss, instability, isolation, and a mind increasingly shaped by private distortions. This inner landscape, years in the making, would erupt into the sequence of shootings that plunged New York into fear. The first attack that would later be linked to David Berkowitz occurred on July 29, 1976, in the Bronx. The summer had settled heavily over New York City, with heat rising from pavement long after midnight. In residential blocks where windows stayed open to catch the faintest breeze, people moved quietly through their routines, unaware that a new pattern of violence was beginning to form in the city's shadows. That night, Donna Loria, 18, and her friend Jody Valenti, 19, sat in Jody's parked car outside Donna's apartment building after returning from an evening out. It was a simple, familiar ritual, talking before saying goodnight. Around 1 a.m., David approached them. There were no words, no warning. He stepped close, raised a .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog revolver, and fired into the car. Donna was killed instantly. Jody was struck but survived. The neighborhood awoke to screams, lights flickering on across the block. Police arrived within minutes, but the shooter had already disappeared into the night. At the time, investigators viewed the attack as a targeted shooting or a random act of violence. There was no pattern yet, no reason to suspect the beginning of a series. The heat wave pressed on, and life in the Bronx returned to its rhythm, though a quiet unease lingered. The second shooting came on October 23, 1976, in Flushing, Queens. Carl Denaro, 20, and Rosemary Keenan, 18, were sitting in a parked car when the windows exploded inward under the force of gunfire. Carl was severely injured, but he survived. Rosemary escaped unharmed. Police found shell casings, but ballistics were inconclusive at this early stage. Investigators noted the similarity to the July attack. A young couple in a parked car, no robbery, no confrontation, but the city saw hundreds of violent incidents each month. A connection wasn't made. 2 weeks later, the pattern continued. On November 26, 1976, in Bayside, 16-year-old Donna DeMasi and 18-year-old Joanne Lomino were walking home from a movie when a man approached them on the sidewalk. He struck up brief conversation, pretending to ask for directions, then stepped back and fired. Joanne was left paralyzed. Donna was wounded, but survived. The shooter fled without a word. Witness descriptions were limited. A young man, medium build, glasses, but nothing distinct enough to isolate him. Winter passed, and the attacks resumed with the same chilling precision. On January 30, 1977, in Forest Hills, Queens, 26-year-old Christine Freund and 30-year-old John D.L. were sitting in a parked car near a railroad station. 3 shots shattered the windows. Christine was fatally wounded. D.L. survived. This time, detectives noted the caliber. The bullets matched those from previous scenes. The cases, once scattered, now pointed toward a single gun, and therefore a single shooter. By February, NYPD had begun to consider the possibility of a serial attacker, though the term "Son of Sam" had not yet entered the narrative. Police increased patrols near lovers' lanes, residential streets, and parking lots. Still, the shooter remained elusive, striking without pattern of geography or schedule, choosing victims who had no connection to one another. The next attack came on March 8, 1977, in Queens Village. Virginia Voskerichian, 19, a Barnard College student, was walking home from class when she was shot at close range. Witnesses heard a single crack echo through the street. Virginia collapsed instantly, a textbook still clutched in her arms. The bullet recovered from the scene again matched the .44 caliber revolver. New York City, already strained by blackout fears and economic turmoil, now faced a threat that seemed both random and calculated. Newspapers began to speculate about a lone gunman targeting young women. police established a task force, Operation Omega, that grew into one of the largest investigative units in city history. Despite the increased pressure, David continued to move through the city unnoticed. He worked his shifts at the Postal Service, maintained a quiet apartment in Yonkers, and blended into crowds effortlessly. He drove through the boroughs at night, often circling areas for hours before selecting a target. There was no conversation, no visible emotion, no escalation in brutality, only the repetition of a single, cold pattern: approach, fire, disappear. By late March 1977, fear had begun to shape the city. Couples avoided parked cars. Teenagers avoided late walks. Families kept lights on through the night. The city was bracing for the next attack, though no one knew it would come with a letter, a message that would name the killer and plunge New York into deeper terror. On April 17, 1977, the violence escalated. Around 3 a.m. in the Bronx, 20-year-old Alexander Esau and 18-year-old Valentina Suriani sat together in a parked car on a quiet residential block. They had been talking for hours, preparing to say goodnight. The street was still. The night carried the faint hum of distant traffic. Then, without warning, 4 shots tore through the windows. Valentina was killed instantly. Alexander died hours later in the hospital. Inside the car, police recovered something new: a folded, handwritten note addressed to the police and homicide investigators. It was the first letter from the man who called himself Son of Sam. The handwriting was jagged, the tone theatrical, disjointed. He mocked the police, spoke of demons and torment, and signed the letter with a symbol that looked like an inverted U with crossed lines. The message was confusing, almost rambling, but its intent was unmistakable. The killer was aware of the chaos he had created, and he wanted the city to know he was watching. This letter transformed the investigation. NYPD now faced not just a pattern of attacks, but a killer who intended to communicate, someone who seemed to welcome the attention. Psychologists were brought in to analyze the writing. Detectives worked through the night, mapping every known attack, comparing ballistics, building a psychological profile, and preparing for the public panic they knew would follow. Only a week after the letter was discovered, its contents were leaked to the press. Newspapers ran headlines in bold capitals: "Son of Sam writes police." Fear that had been simmering for months now erupted into full public alarm. Through May and June, the task force, now over 300 officers, conducted undercover patrols, stakeouts, and nightly sweeps across multiple boroughs. NYPD cars cruised silently through lovers' lanes and quiet residential blocks. Helicopters circled above. The city lived in a state of heightened vigilance, yet the killer remained invisible. Then came the night of June 26, 1977, in Bayside, Queens. Sal Lupo, 20, and Judy Placido, 17, sat together in a parked car after leaving a party. They had heard of Son of Sam, like everyone else, but the attack seemed distant, something that happened in other neighborhoods, to strangers they'd read about in the papers. At around 3 a.m., shots shattered the quiet. Both were wounded but survived. Witnesses reported seeing a man fleeing into the darkness, but details were inconsistent. Some thought he had long hair, others short. Some saw a car, others didn't. The task force increased its presence again, operating at maximum capacity, but David continued to slip through surveillance with unnerving ease. During these months, his life outside the attacks remained ordinary. He continued working at the Postal Service, often appearing quiet, calm, unremarkable. He visited local shops, exchanged short greetings with neighbors, and maintained a routine that drew no suspicion. His apartment in Yonkers was cluttered, dimly lit, but outwardly unremarkable. No one who crossed paths with him imagined him capable of orchestrating a reign of fear across New York City. On July 31, 1977, the final attack occurred. Brooklyn, near the Shore Parkway. The night was hot and windless, typical of a New York summer. Robert Violante, 20, and Stacy Moskowitz, 20, were parked near a playground after spending the evening together. They sat close, talking softly, the air thick with humidity. Just after 2 a.m., David approached the car from the passenger side. He fired 3 times through the window. Stacy was fatally wounded. Robert survived but was left permanently blind in one eye. This final shooting would become the pivotal moment in the case, not because of David's actions, but because of what happened minutes before. A resident had noticed a suspiciously parked yellow Ford Galaxy near a fire hydrant and reported it. A parking summons was issued. The vehicle would soon become the thread that unraveled everything. But on that night, at that hour, the killer vanished yet again into the city's vastness, leaving behind chaos, shattered glass, and the final echo of his .44 caliber revolver. By early August, the task force had narrowed its focus. Witness reports, ballistic matches, and the growing map of shootings formed a pattern that was becoming clearer. The city waited for answers with growing urgency. The investigation was about to pivot from fear and rumor to precise, actionable evidence. The next link would come not from the crime scenes, but from bureaucracy. A traffic ticket written at exactly the right time pinned beneath a wiper blade on a yellow car in Brooklyn. The final phase of the early attacks unfolded in the weeks leading up to David Berkowitz's arrest, as New York drifted deeper into a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and relentless speculation. By August 1977, the Son of Sam case dominated the city's consciousness. Newspapers sold out before dawn. Late-night radio hosts debated theories. Couples avoided parked cars. Police patrolled in unmarked vehicles, their presence unmistakable even without sirens. Behind this public tension, the killer moved quietly, commuting from his Yonkers apartment to the Bronx post office, driving long loops through Queens and Brooklyn after sunset, looking for scenes that matched the pattern he had constructed. By this time, NYPD's Operation Omega had grown into a massive investigative machine. Detectives cross-referenced thousands of interviews, reviewed incident maps pinned across entire walls, and studied the killer's letter for clues about personality and geography. The city felt divided between two forces: millions hoping the nightmare would end, and investigators who feared another attack was imminent. The aftermath of the July 31st shooting intensified everything. The death of Stacy Moskowitz and the wounding of Robert Violante became front-page news across the country. It was the first attack with a large number of witnesses nearby. Several people recalled seeing a man loitering near cars. Others described a figure disappearing into a wooded area beside the Belt Parkway. But one detail became crucial. A resident had seen a yellow Ford Galaxy parked illegally on the block minutes before the shooting. This small piece of ordinary paperwork, a parking citation, would soon prove more valuable than months of surveillance. Throughout early August, detectives worked in near constant motion. They retraced steps near previous crime scenes, pulled records of .44 caliber Bulldog revolvers sold in the region, interviewed gun shop owners, and cross-checked psychiatric records and criminal histories. Yet none of these efforts produced a solid lead. Then, on August 9, 1977, a breakthrough arrived almost quietly. Detectives reviewing parking summonses near the Moskowitz shooting recovered the yellow car ticket issued minutes before the attack. The vehicle was registered to a postal worker in Yonkers, David Berkowitz. The name did not initially stand out, but when investigators traced a letter Berkowitz had once sent to a neighbor complaining about noise, a letter written in agitated, dramatic language, they noted a resemblance to the tone of the Son of Sam correspondence. It was not a match, but it was enough to warrant surveillance. Meanwhile, David continued his nightly drives through New York, unaware that his freedom was narrowing. Witnesses later recalled seeing him sitting alone in his car for long stretches, staring through the windshield, motionless, as if waiting for something to shift in the city around him. As detectives gathered materials, the atmosphere inside the task force headquarters shifted. For the first time, there was a sense of proximity, not certainty, but closeness. Interviews with neighbors in Yonkers revealed that Berkowitz had a habit of sitting in his car late at night. Others mentioned he had stared at them through his window. There were no acts of violence reported, nothing overt, just a presence that made some residents uneasy. That same day, the task force decided to move quickly but quietly. They sent officers to Yonkers to confirm the car's license plate, observe Berkowitz's building, and evaluate whether he matched any witness descriptions. Just before midnight on August 10th, the pattern completed itself. Detectives saw Berkowitz exit his apartment building at 35 Pine Street, walk down toward the yellow Ford Galaxy, and reach for the driver's side door. Inside the car, officers had already spotted a bag with a .44 caliber revolver, ammunition, and a letter intended for authorities. When they approached him, weapons drawn but voices steady, he did not run. He did not resist. Instead, he turned and looked directly at them, a faint, unsettling calm settling over his face. His first words, spoken softly, became part of the case's mythology. "Now that you've got me, what's your next move?" Moments later, "I'm Sam." With those words, the first chapter of the murders ended. For more than a year, David Berkowitz had operated in silence, moving through the boroughs like a shadow, choosing victims who had no connection to him, striking without warning. Now he sat in a squad car, quiet, composed, as New York's fear began to loosen. But for investigators, the work had only begun. The arrest answered one question: the identity of the shooter, but left a deeper mystery. How an ordinary postal worker from Yonkers had carried out a sequence of attacks that had terrorized the largest city in the country. The next phase would unravel not only his methods, but the strange, disjointed world he claimed had guided him. By the time the press had named him Son of Sam, the sequence of attacks had already shifted from isolated shootings to a pattern that felt methodical in its repetition. What investigators later recognized as the escalation phase began quietly, not with changes in brutality, but with a growing confidence in movement, timing, and the geography of the city. Throughout the winter of 1976 to 1977, David Berkowitz refined a routine that allowed him to blend into New York's nighttime rhythm. He drove long, looping circuits through the boroughs, often beginning after midnight and continuing into the early hours. The routes changed, the neighborhoods changed, but the underlying logic remained the same. He looked for moments of stillness, for cars sitting alone on dim streets, for young people returning home, for places where sound did not carry far. This escalation was not defined by new techniques. He continued using the same .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog revolver, but by a sense of ease in choosing locations. In the early attacks, he had moved quickly, firing and fleeing with palpable urgency. By early 1977, witnesses began reporting something colder: a man approaching a vehicle with measured steps, disappearing into the darkness without stumbling or rushing. There was no panic in the aftermath, only distance. The investigation, growing in scale, unknowingly contributed to this transformation. The more NYPD flooded specific neighborhoods with patrols and plainclothes officers, the more David adjusted, shifting from the Bronx to Queens, then into Brooklyn, striking in places where the sense of normalcy still lingered. Detectives later noted that he seemed to anticipate patrol patterns, not through inside knowledge, but through the simple observation of where the city grew tense and where it relaxed. A critical moment in this escalation came after the March 8, 1977 murder of Virginia Voskerichian. She had been walking home from class in a quiet Queens neighborhood when she was shot once, directly beneath the porch lights of nearby homes. Witnesses described the killer walking calmly away, not running, not looking back. The single, precise shot indicated a level of focus that investigators found unusual for a street shooter. Ballistics confirmed that the same revolver had been used in previous attacks. With this confirmation, the task force expanded dramatically. Patrol cars lingered near railroad stations, pharmacy parking lots, and quiet intersections. Officers questioned motorists and pedestrians. Helicopters scanned the boroughs at night. Despite this, David continued to travel in his car, often slipping unnoticed into areas he knew were less monitored. During this period, he began expressing his growing obsession in letters drafted privately. Some of these writings, disordered, rambling, marked by references to torment, would later be found in his apartment. Others, notably those sent to police and newspapers, signaled a shift in his relationship to the crimes. He no longer merely acted, he wanted to be acknowledged. This desire for presence, for recognition, intensified during the escalation. The killing on April 17, 1977, of Valentina Suriani and Alexander Esau marked another step in this direction. Leaving a handwritten letter at the scene was a deliberate act, a sign that he wanted the police to engage with his identity, or at least the identity he constructed for himself. Its tone, steeped in self-mythology, added a psychological dimension to the investigation, deepening public panic. After that attack, David continued to operate with increased boldness. Multiple witnesses across the boroughs recalled seeing a man approaching cars or walking the streets in the early morning hours, but his appearance was so ordinary, short hair, glasses, average build, that none of the sightings could be confirmed with certainty. The city was filled with men who looked like him. By the summer of 1977, the atmosphere in New York had shifted from fear to something closer to paralysis. Couples avoided parked cars. Some refused to go out after dark. Barbers reported unusual numbers of men requesting haircuts to avoid matching the long-haired suspect, described in early witness accounts, a detail so widespread that NYPD eventually warned the public that the killer might cut his own hair to blend in. In this climate, David's movements became even more deliberate. He favored locations near expressways or parks, where escape routes were plentiful. He avoided areas with sudden bursts of nightlife, instead choosing quiet blocks where streetlights flickered weakly. Witnesses occasionally reported seeing him walking with a purpose, as though moving toward a predetermined point. In reality, the escalation was not a matter of growing technical skill, but of increasing psychological commitment. The attacks became part of a private rhythm, a cycle of anticipation, execution, and retreat. Investigators would later describe this phase as the moment the killer felt completely untouchable, operating within a city too vast and strained to isolate one man. By late July, the task force believed another attack was imminent. They were right, but they could not predict how a simple act of routine bureaucracy, a parking summons, would end the escalation and reveal the man behind the pattern. Through the summer of 1977, the killings continued to shape the city's behavior as much as the daily news cycle. Every new headline magnified tension. Every night brought rumors that the killer had been seen anywhere from Brooklyn to Yonkers. In this climate, David Berkowitz moved with quiet certainty. His attacks were not more violent or more frequent than before. They remained consistent, but the psychological impact of each one intensified as New York reached a breaking point. After the April 17th double shooting and the recovery of the first Son of Sam letter, something subtle shifted in the nature of the manhunt. Earlier attacks had been contained in their reach. Now every police division in the city joined the search. NYPD created rotating patrol grids, canvassed entire blocks door to door, and saturated neighborhoods with plainclothes officers. But the more resources poured into the case, the more David adapted, avoiding the boroughs where patrols thickened and gravitating toward areas still running on predictable silence. The attack on June 26, 1977, in Bayside, Queens, where Judy Placido and Sal Lupo survived gunfire, marked a critical point. Witnesses reported seeing a man walking briskly away from the scene, one hand in his jacket pocket, shoulders slightly hunched, disappearing into the night. None could describe him in detail. The scene unfolded so quickly that their memories blurred into fragments. A face glimpsed in passing headlights. The outline of a figure turned away, the faint sound of footsteps retreating. The city's fear deepened. Couples avoided cars entirely, choosing instead to meet in public places. Parents instructed their children to travel in groups, even in daylight. Residents scrutinized parking lots and quiet streets, reporting any unfamiliar vehicle. Newspaper boxes ran out before noon. Taxi drivers refused to pick up solitary passengers late at night. All of this took place beneath the ordinary rhythm of a city of 8 million. But at its core, New York was holding its breath. During these months, David's private world remained unchanged. His apartment in Yonkers was small and disorderly, with stacks of papers, letters, and boxes of belongings. Neighbors found him strange but quiet. He came and went at irregular hours, often sitting alone in his car well past midnight. No one realized these nighttime vigils were part of the pattern. Quiet moments before he drove into the city to search for another target. Operation Omega, the task force created specifically to catch the killer, operated almost continuously that summer. Detectives compiled timelines of gun shop purchases, cross-referenced every registered .44 caliber bulldog, and tracked down hundreds of tips. Charts covered entire walls. Borough maps were marked with clusters of red pins. Yet the city was too large, the potential suspects too many, and the killer too ordinary in appearance to isolate. What investigators didn't know was that David was watching the coverage closely. He read the newspapers, noting which details the police believed, which theories they dismissed, and how the public reacted. But unlike some serial offenders, he did not alter his method to mislead authorities. His killings remained steady in pattern and execution. The only evolution, and the heart of the escalation, was his sense of inevitability. He believed he would not be caught. Two details made the task force's job harder. First, attacks occurred across multiple boroughs, each with its own precincts and investigative rhythms. Second, the killer struck only sporadically, with weeks or months between shootings. That distance worked to his advantage, dissolving urgency between attacks and complicating predictive efforts. Still, police sensed a convergence point. After the June shooting, detectives noticed a shift in his movement. The killings were drifting southward, toward Brooklyn. Patrols increased near parks and expressways, especially in neighborhoods where young couples gathered after dark. On July 31st, 1977, the escalation reached its final point. That night, David drove into Brooklyn along a familiar route. He circled the Shore Parkway area several times, watching parked cars, searching for the stillness he relied on. The humidity was heavy, the kind that made sound hang in the air. At around 2 a.m., he found a spot where the shadows cooperated, a small parking area near a playground. Inside a parked Buick, Robert Violante and Stacy Moskowitz sat talking quietly. They didn't see him approach. The shots came suddenly. 3 flashes, glass breaking, a brief cry. Stacy was mortally wounded. Robert survived, but with lasting injury. The killer slipped into the darkness, disappearing between trees and street lamps. This final attack contained the detail that would break the case. Minutes earlier, a neighbor had noticed a suspicious yellow Ford Galaxy parked near a fire hydrant. Thinking it unusual for the block, she wrote down part of the plate number. Moments later, an NYPD officer issued a parking summons on the same car. Neither witness nor officer knew it, but they had recorded the single mistake in David's otherwise consistent routine. As the city reeled from the last attack, NYPD finally held the thread that could tie the pattern to a name. And with that thread, the escalation phase, which had lasted more than a year, was nearing its end. In the days following the July 31, 1977 shooting, The massive investigation that had stretched across New York for more than a year began to converge. The escalation, which had thrived on anonymity and the vastness of the city, was now closing in on a single point: a car parked illegally on a Brooklyn street, minutes before the final attack. At first, the yellow Ford Galaxy seemed like just another detail in a case filled with thousands of them. The block where the shooting occurred had been crowded. Witnesses reported dozens of people passing through the area that night. But when detectives sorted through parking summonses near the scene, the ticket stood out because of its timing. It had been issued just before the gunfire. The car's registration traced back to David Berkowitz, a postal worker living in Yonkers. Detectives were struck by the simplicity of the lead, a routine citation that had survived only because a patrol officer had done his job on an unremarkable night. But before moving in, investigators needed confirmation. They interviewed neighbors along Pine Street in Yonkers, piecing together impressions of the man behind that license plate. The accounts were unsettling, though not criminal. Some residents recalled David sitting alone in his car for long stretches, staring forward without expression. Others mentioned unusual hours, the sound of his door closing late at night, or the strange energy of someone who seemed both present and distant. A few described odd letters he had written to neighbors, argumentative and rambling, echoing the theatrical language in the Son of Sam notes. Meanwhile, detectives searched the New York City Parking Violations Bureau for any record connecting Berkowitz to other neighborhoods involved in the case. A pattern emerged. Traffic tickets and car sightings placed him near multiple boroughs at odd hours. None of this proved guilt, but combined with ballistic evidence, letter analysis, and the July 31st timeline, it strengthened the growing suspicion. Operation Omega, which had been stretched thin for months, began focusing their efforts on Yonkers. Surveillance teams positioned themselves discreetly near Berkowitz's building. They observed him entering and leaving without apparent concern. His movements were calm, predictable. There was no sign that he sensed the tightening perimeter. By August 9th, detectives had confirmed enough supporting details to justify a closer inspection. They reviewed a copy of a letter he had written to a woman living downstairs, a note filled with agitated, accusatory phrasing. When compared against the earlier Son of Sam letters, the tone was disturbingly similar, disordered, dramatic, tinged with resentment. While not identical in handwriting, it reinforced the belief that they were circling the right man. That same evening, detectives met with Yonkers police to prepare the approach. The plan was simple: watch the car, observe Berkowitz, and wait for the moment when probable cause would allow them to act. They did not want a confrontation in daylight or on a crowded street. David carried a revolver. He had proven he could fire quickly and without hesitation. The escalation, the silent pattern of movement, the long drives, the calculated selection of isolated moments, was about to collapse under its own weight. Late on August 10th, a humid Wednesday night, the street outside 35 Pine Street settled into quiet. The surveillance team watched the building from multiple angles. Lights flickered behind apartment curtains. A dog barked in the distance. Beyond that, the block was still. Just before midnight, the front door opened. David Berkowitz stepped outside. He walked with measured stride down the incline toward his car, the Ford Galaxy parked beneath a weak street lamp. He carried nothing unusual, no bag or equipment. He reached for the driver's side handle. Detectives moved at once, silently, efficiently, emerging from the shadows with weapons drawn. "David, don't move." He stopped, slowly turned, and looked directly at them. What followed was not the frantic struggle many had imagined during the months of fear. There was no attempt to flee, no denial, no shock. Instead, with a faint, hollow calm, he said the words detectives would repeat in statements for decades. "Well, you got me." And when one officer asked if he knew why they were there, he responded, "I'm Sam." Inside the car, detectives found a .44 caliber Bulldog revolver, ammunition, and a letter intended for law enforcement, confirming the connection beyond doubt. The escalation that had defined the Son of Sam case, a year of sporadic violence, letters, shifting boroughs, and sleepless nights across the city, ended not with a chase, but with a quiet surrender on a Yonkers street. For investigators, the next stage would be the longest, unraveling the full extent of his actions, his motives, his writings, and the psychological landscape behind a spree that had shaken New York to it. In the early hours of August 11, 1977, only minutes after his quiet arrest on Pine Street, David Berkowitz sat in the back of an NYPD vehicle as it descended from Yonkers into the Bronx. The city was still dark, humid, and restless, the same city he had driven through countless nights while searching for victims. Now he moved through it as a suspect under guard, silent and composed, while police radios buzzed with the confirmation that the manhunt was finally over. Inside the precinct, detectives led him to an interview room. There was no chaos, no shouting. Officers approached him with deliberate calm. They had rehearsed this moment for months. David was seated at a metal table under a muted fluorescent light. His demeanor did not change. He folded his hands. He waited. When detectives began questioning him, he answered without hesitation. His voice was low but steady, free of agitation or struggle. He acknowledged the .44 caliber revolver found in his car. He identified himself as the individual behind the shootings. He made no attempt to obscure details. Officers noted that he seemed almost relieved, not triumphant, but released from a private weight he had carried alone. The interrogation lasted for hours. He described driving through the boroughs at night, searching for quiet streets, choosing moments when couples sat alone or when a solitary figure walked toward home under dim streetlights. He spoke of parking his car at a distance, approaching on foot, firing and leaving immediately. There was no elaboration, no dramatic language, only a flat recounting of the events. As detectives listened, what disturbed them most was the absence of emotional fluctuation. There was no anger in his tone, no fear, no remorse. When they asked why he had continued, he spoke vaguely about compulsion, about something inside that pushed him forward. He offered no coherent motive. His answers drifted between confusion, deflection, and the remnants of the theatrical mythology he had created in his letters. But none of it provided the clarity investigators hoped for. By mid-morning, word of the arrest spread through the precinct. Officers from multiple boroughs, Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx, arrived to compare notes. Each investigator recognized elements of their open cases in David's statements. Ballistics matched, the timing matched, witness descriptions matched. For the first time since the killings began, the scattered fragments of the investigation aligned into a single structure. Operation Omega, the task force formed specifically to capture the Son of Sam, pivoted rapidly from pursuit to confirmation. Detectives reviewed the ballistic evidence, matching the recovered bullets from previous crime scenes to the revolver found in David's car. The results were exact. The Charter Arms Bulldog was the weapon used in the shootings, stretching back more than a year. Simultaneously, investigators executed a search warrant at his Yonkers apartment. They found the rooms cluttered with clothing, papers, and personal items. Among the belongings were the rambling notebooks in which David had recorded thoughts, frustrations, and fragmented reflections. There were no trophies from the murders. Nothing in the apartment suggested meticulous planning. Instead, the rooms reflected the quiet isolation of a man who lived largely within his own mind. Detectives also found earlier drafts of letters similar in tone to those sent to police and newspapers, writings filled with chaotic symbolism and disordered references. These documents, though not evidence of operational planning, confirmed that the letters had been created by David alone, not as part of a conspiracy or external influence. Throughout the day, forensic teams moved between the apartment, his car, and the precinct. Every detail mattered: handwriting samples, fingerprints, ammunition boxes, the letter addressed to a police captain discovered in his vehicle. All evidence converged toward the same conclusion. Meanwhile, the city reacted with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Crowds gathered outside precincts. Reporters pushed microphones through barricades, shouting questions to officers who offered only the confirmation that a suspect was in custody. For the first time in more than a year, headlines spoke not of fear, but of arrest. Yet inside the interrogation rooms, detectives felt the gravity of the task ahead. The arrest had ended the spree, but the investigation was just beginning. They needed to reconstruct every attack, verify every confession, and build a case capable of withstanding courtroom scrutiny. They needed to understand the man sitting quietly across from them, a postal worker who had moved through the city unnoticed while carrying out one of the most widely publicized series of shootings in American history. By nightfall, after nearly a full day of questioning, one thing was clear. David Berkowitz was not attempting to conceal anything. He spoke plainly about the attacks. He acknowledged being the man police had sought for over a year, but the puzzle of his motives, his internal logic, and the strange mythology embedded in his letters remained unresolved, fragments for investigators to piece together over the coming months. When the sun rose over New York on August 11, 1977, the city woke into a strange quiet. For more than a year, fear had lingered in every unlit street and every parked car. Now, with David Berkowitz in custody, detectives moved through the precinct with a different kind of tension, not relief, but a heavy, concentrated focus. They had found the man. Now they needed to understand the pattern that had wrapped itself around 4 boroughs. In the interview room, David sat beneath a dim fluorescent light that hummed faintly against the early heat. The walls were plain, the table metal, the air still. Detectives entering the room noted the same thing again and again. He looked calm, almost suspended, like a man who had been waiting for this moment far longer than they had. His posture didn't shift, and when he spoke, his voice stayed level. Not cold, not hostile, just unnervingly steady. The questions began at once. They asked about the gun, the car, the shootings, the nights spent driving through Queens and Brooklyn. David answered without resistance. He spoke of the revolver in simple terms, acknowledged being present at each scene, described his movements with unsettling clarity. There was no attempt to mislead, no unraveling, no panic, only a quiet, consistent explanation of where he had stood, how many shots he'd fired, and how he'd walked away through the dark streets. Detectives who had chased shadows for over a year now faced the reality of the man behind them, a postal worker who walked the halls of a Bronx sorting center by day and moved through the boroughs by night as if following a private map only he could see. As the interrogation continued, teams executed a second search of his Yonkers apartment. The building stood on a steep hill, the kind that made footsteps echo strangely at night. Inside the small, cluttered rooms, officers moved cautiously, making sense of disordered piles of clothing, unopened letters, and notebooks filled with fragmented thoughts. There were no trophies from the shootings, no elaborate evidence of planning, just scattered pages where he had recorded his private frustrations, spiraling ideas and disjointed references that echoed lines from his letters to the press. What they did find was enough to confirm the shape of his inner world. Isolated, agitated, closed in on itself. The scraps of writing did not explain the murders, but they illuminated the state of mind that had preceded them. Back at the precinct, the investigation spread across rooms and hallways. Detectives from Queens compared notes with officers from the Bronx. Brooklyn investigators brought photographs, maps, and ballistic diagrams. In each detail, the angle of shattered glass, the recovered bullets, the witness timelines, David's statements aligned with the physical evidence. The revolver found in his car matched the signatures on shells collected from scenes going back to July 1976. The handwriting in his apartment matched the Son of Sam letters in their jagged, pressured strokes, and his descriptions of the victims, the positioning of the cars, and the direction he fled each time were exact. disturbingly exact. Outside, the press intensified. Crowds gathered behind the barricades, calling questions toward officers who pushed past them with silence and lowered eyes. Many in the city felt a kind of disbelief that the man responsible for so much terror looked like someone they might ignore on the subway or pass in a supermarket aisle. Reporters hammered out updates before each briefing even ended. Editorials questioned how one person could have eluded an entire city, slipping between boroughs like a figure in a story told late at night. But inside the precinct, the work was sober and methodical. Detectives revisited every shooting, reconstructing each scene as if laying a long, weighty chain across the table. They understood now how David had moved through the city, always alone, always choosing places where sound fell quickly into darkness, always disappearing before anyone could connect the fleeing stranger to the postal worker who returned to Yonkers before dawn. Through the second day, David remained cooperative. He did not elaborate beyond what detectives asked, but he did not conceal anything either. When they pressed him on motives, his answers drifted, vague and fragmented. The investigators realized they would never receive a coherent psychological explanation. There was only the fact of the acts themselves. 8 attacks, 13 victims, 6 dead, all carried out by a man who now sat quietly in a chair with his hands folded. In the evening, a senior detective stepped out of the interrogation room and paused in the hallway, noting how the day's heat had settled into the building, making the air feel heavier than usual. He later said that this was the moment he understood the case was no longer about identifying the killer, but about telling the story in a way the city could accept. Clear, precise, complete. By the end of the second night, the evidence converged into a single, irrefutable picture. The gun, the letters, the confessions, the witness accounts, all pointed toward the same man sitting quietly in the next room. The manhunt was over. The explanation had begun, but the full weight of what had happened and why would unfold slowly in courtrooms, in psychiatric evaluations, and in the long, quiet hours that followed the city's first breath of relief in more than a year. In the days that followed, the investigation deepened into a slow, meticulous descent through every moment of the past year. Detectives who had once roamed through boroughs with urgency now moved with a different kind of weight. The knowledge that the man responsible was already seated in an interview room, quietly recounting the events that had reshaped New York's nights. The task force spread out across tables, hallways, and borrowed offices. Maps of the city were unrolled and pinned, marked with dates and initials. Each red circle represented a moment of violence. Together they formed a constellation that had hovered over the city without a name until now. Investigators compared these maps with Berkowitz's statements, tracing the paths he described. Routes taken through empty streets, turns made at familiar corners, the way he drifted between boroughs, like someone moving through a dream that only he could interpret. As each detail aligned, detectives understood how he had slipped past them. There had been no pattern they could rely on, no motive that clarified his choices, no connection between victims. Everything had been bound only by opportunity, by the quiet moments he sought and the city provided. The interrogation sessions continued with the same unnerving calm. David sat with his hands loosely folded, answering questions as though recounting a sequence he had memorized. He named locations with ease, remembered the weather on certain nights, recalled where he had parked, how far he walked, the angle from which he fired. There was no embellishment, no pride, no visible remorse, only a clear familiarity with the events, as though speaking about something that had long been settled in his mind. Detectives noted the odd duality. He was coherent and measured, yet adrift in explanations. When asked why he had continued, his words tangled into vague references to compulsion, isolation, and impulses he struggled to describe. Nothing he said clarified a motive. Instead, every answer seemed to deepen the mystery of who he had been before the first shot was fired. Meanwhile, the evidence gathered through months of searching now fit together with unnerving precision. Ballistic reports confirmed the identity of the weapon beyond doubt. The letters found in his apartment echoed the tone of the ones that had taunted police. The timeline he described fit seamlessly into the chronology of attacks. Multiple survivors recognized details in his voice and manner, and a citywide search for any sign of accomplices returned the same answer repeatedly. There had been none. Everything he had done alone. Outside the precinct, the atmosphere grew strange, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and a quiet kind of grief. Crowds gathered behind police barriers, hoping for a glimpse of the figure who had altered the rhythm of their nights. Some felt anger, others curiosity, but most felt the echo of a fear that was only beginning to recede. Newspapers rushed to print special editions. Radio hosts tried to explain the case to listeners who still left lights on at night out of habit. Inside, detectives worked with subdued concentration. At times, the building felt almost silent, broken only by the rustle of case files or the low murmur of officers comparing observations. A sense of solemn purpose filled the rooms, not triumph, but responsibility. The city needed the truth, the complete truth, not the rumors that had circulated for months. As the final pieces were assembled, prosecutors stepped in to prepare charges. They reviewed every statement, every map, every photograph. Their role was not to interpret why the shootings had happened, but to prove how they had. And the proof was now overwhelming. 8 attacks, 6 deaths, 7 wounded, 1 revolver, and a man who had confessed to each act with unwavering consistency. In late August, as preparations began for the formal arraignment, David Berkowitz was transferred into secure custody. The city quieted around the news. The man whose actions had shaped the behavior of millions was no longer driving through empty streets or walking toward parked cars. He was behind locked doors, watched constantly, his world reduced to a narrow corridor and a cell. For the detectives who had chased shadows for more than a year, a particular kind of exhaustion set in. The exhaustion that comes after prolonged vigilance, when adrenaline finally recedes and leaves only the memory of the chase. Some officers later said that the weight of the case never fully left them, that whenever they drove through the boroughs at night, they still saw echoes of the scenes they had worked, the places where quiet had been broken by a sudden crack of gunfire. But the case was now complete. The man who had moved through the city like a phantom had been brought into the light. The next and final step, the courtroom, the sentence, and the long aftermath, would close the story for the city, but not erase the year of fear it had endured. When the court proceedings began in May 1978, the atmosphere around the courthouse felt markedly different from the frantic months that had preceded the arrest. New York was no longer gripped by nightly fear, but something colder remained, a collective memory of the long summer when the city held its breath. Now, instead of searching the shadows, detectives, families, and reporters gathered in quiet hallways, waiting for the legal process to turn months of terror into a formal verdict. David Berkowitz entered the courtroom under heavy guard. He moved with the same slow, deliberate posture that had unsettled officers during his arrest. There was no spectacle in his demeanor, no visible remorse, no defiance. He simply took his seat at the defense table, hands folded, eyes cast downward, as though observing proceedings from a distance. Dozens of reporters filled the benches, notebooks open, pens lifted, waiting for some dramatic outburst or confession. But the trial did not unfold in theatrics. It unfolded in documentation, the weight of evidence assembled piece by piece. Prosecutors presented ballistic reports confirming the .44 caliber revolver found in Berkowitz's car as the weapon used in the shootings. Detectives testified about the letters, the maps, the interviews, the search of the Yonkers apartment. Survivors recounted the moments when quiet streets erupted in gunfire, Their voices were steady but marked with the memory of sudden violence. At every session, Berkowitz listened with a stillness that felt unnatural, as though the events described belonged to someone else entirely. But when asked to speak, he did not dispute the facts. Instead, he gave brief, muted answers, acknowledging responsibility while offering no attempt to explain motive. Earlier psychiatric evaluations had determined that he was competent to stand trial, aware of his actions, able to follow proceedings, and fully understanding the charges brought against him. In the end, there was little suspense in the legal outcome. On May 8th, there was little suspense in the legal outcome. On May 8, 1978, David Berkowitz formally pleaded guilty to the 6 murders and the additional attempted murders linked to the Son of Sam attacks. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the charges one by one. Each count felt like a step taken back through the year of fear, each name a reminder of the nights when New York stood still. On June 12, 1978, the sentence was delivered. The judge imposed 6 consecutive life terms, a structure ensuring that Berkowitz would never walk free. The decision reflected the scale of the crimes and the profound trauma inflicted on the city. As he was led from the courtroom, he did not look at the crowd, nor at the reporters waiting behind the railing. He moved with the same quiet composure he had maintained since the night he was arrested, disappearing down a corridor lined with uniformed officers. For New York, the trial marked the end of the public chapter. But for Berkowitz, the next phase would unfold far from the city he had terrorized, in the slow, confined passage of time behind prison walls. After the sentencing, David Berkowitz was transferred from the courthouse to the state correctional system, entering a world far removed from the crowded streets and sleepless nights that had shaped his final year of freedom. The prison's interior felt colder than the courtroom, not in temperature, but in the sense of permanence. Here, there were no reporters, no detectives, no drawn maps of boroughs, only the quiet sound of metal doors closing behind him. He was placed under strict supervision, initially confined to a maximum security facility where movement was limited and isolation was routine. Guards who encountered him during those early days noted the same unsettling calm. He followed instructions without resistance, spoke minimally, and kept to himself. His world, once defined by long drives through sleeping neighborhoods, had shrunk to a narrow cell with a bed, a small desk, and a barred window that admitted little light. For the state, his future was already sealed. 6 consecutive life sentences left no possibility of release, no avenue for a return to the world he had once navigated with nocturnal precision. Over time, he was transferred through several institutions, eventually settling in Shawangunk Correctional Facility, and later Sullivan Correctional Facility in upstate New York, where he remains to this day. His days are structured by routine, regulated meals, limited recreation, monitored interactions, silence. Outside the prison walls, the legacy of the Son of Sam case persisted. New York spent years dissecting the failures and successes of the investigation. The fragmented jurisdiction across boroughs, the massive scale of Operation Omega, the role of the press, and the unexpected break provided by a simple parking ticket. The case influenced police coordination protocols and shaped future approaches to serial crime in large metropolitan areas. For the families of the victims, the sentencing did not offer closure in the cinematic sense. Many expressed relief that the man responsible would never again walk free, but the weight of loss endured. For survivors who lived through the attacks, the courtroom testimonies reopened memories that never faded entirely. The city, too, carried a lasting memory. A year when nighttime routine became ritual caution, when streetlights felt insufficient, when the sound of a distant car window closing could draw a shiver of instinctive fear. In the decades that followed, Berkowitz remained largely withdrawn from public attention, speaking only occasionally through written statements or interviews granted from behind prison walls. His explanations for the shootings shifted over time, sometimes framed as delusion, sometimes as remorse, but none altered the factual record established in court. The core of the case remained unchanged. 8 attacks, 13 victims, 6 deaths, and a city transformed by a sequence of moments that arrived without warning. Inside his cell, time moved differently. Days accumulated into years, marked not by seasons or city life, but by the regulated rhythm of prison routine. The man who once traversed boroughs in the early hours of the morning now walked only short distances in confined spaces. The noise of traffic was replaced by the steady clang of metal gates and the murmur of distant voices. The story of David Berkowitz did not end with revelation or transformation. It ended with confinement, an unbroken line of days stretching into the future, each one the same as the last. For New York, the case became part of its history, retold in documentaries, books, and articles, a reminder of how a single year of violence can ripple across decades. And in a cell far from the city he once stalked, the man at the center of that history sits in the long silence that follows the final verdict.